To think that if you stop working out, your muscle is somehow miraculously going to turn to fat would be the equivalent of thinking that an orange can somehow turn into an apple. Well, an orange cannot turn into an apple and muscle cannot turn to fat. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to be debunking the myth that if you stop working out, your muscle is going to turn to fat. But before I start, you guys know the drill. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, ding ding ding. And if you don't want to watch the entire video, I will be including timestamps in the description so you can skip ahead to the section that you want. Now, onto the topic at hand. The myth that if you stop working out, your muscle is going to turn to fat has been circulating, and it is something that I have heard ever since I first started working out. I remember when I first got into training, people used to always tell me, well, now you're going to have to keep training for the rest of your life because if you stop training, all of that muscle that you built is going to turn to fat. And this simply is not the case, and I'm going to explain to you exactly why. Basically, fat and muscle are two completely different types of tissue. When it comes to fat or adipose tissue, it is loose connective tissue and it is composed primarily of adipocytes, and it specializes in storing energy as fat. Whereas with regard to muscle tissue is soft tissue and it is composed of elongated cells called muscle fibers. One of the things with regard to muscle is they are responsible for muscle contraction and also movement. So to think that if you stop working out, your muscle is somehow miraculously going to turn to fat would be the equivalent of thinking that an orange can somehow turn into an apple. Well, an orange cannot turn into an apple and muscle cannot turn to fat. And the other thing is how we gain or lose fat is a completely different process from how we gain or lose muscle. With regard to whether or not we gain or lose fat, at the end of the day, whether we gain or lose fat is going to come down to calories in versus calories out. There's absolutely no way around that. If you are in a caloric deficit, you are going to lose weight and fat. If you are in a caloric surplus, you are going to gain weight. If the amount of calories that you take in is equal to that of your total daily energy expenditure, then your weight is going to stay exactly the same. And in terms of how much you can expect to gain or lose, there are roughly 3,500 calories in 1 pound of fat. So if you are in a caloric deficit of 500 calories per day, 500 times 7 equals 3,500, which equals 1 pound of fat. So if you are in a caloric deficit of 500 calories per day, that is going to equate to 1 pound of fat loss per week. Whereas with regard to muscle, it doesn't really come down to calories in versus calories out, because in order to build or lose muscle, it comes down to your level of muscle protein synthesis versus your level of muscle protein breakdown. The way it works, if your level of muscle protein synthesis exceeds that of your level of muscle protein breakdown, then you are going to build muscle. If your level of muscle protein breakdown exceeds that of your level of your muscle protein synthesis, then you are going to lose muscle. And in terms of actually building muscle, there are two requirements when it comes to building muscle. One, you need some type of external stimulus, because if you don't have an external stimulus, then your muscles aren't really going to have any reason to grow and get stronger and bigger. And the second thing is you need an adequate amount of protein. With regard to an adequate amount, what exactly does that mean? Well, it's going to vary from individual to individual. Basically, your protein requirements are going to come down into a range. It's not just going to be a single number that's going to be appropriate for everybody. Depending on the amount of calories that you take in, that is going to determine how much protein you need. Most people, depending on the amount of calories that they are taking in, their protein requirements are going to range anywhere from 0.8 grams per pound all the way to 1.5 grams. Now, when you are in a caloric surplus, your body is going to be in a more anabolic state. So if you are in a caloric surplus, you can get away with the lower end of that range, something like a 0.8 grams per pound. Whereas if you are in a caloric deficit, when you are in a caloric deficit, your body is going to be in a more naturally catabolic state. Catabolism is when your muscle breaks down. So if you are in a caloric deficit, then you're going to want to get closer to that 1.5 grams, depending on the deficit. If you're in a small deficit, you won't need to get that high of a protein intake. If you are in an extreme deficit and you want to build muscle, then you're going to have to hit that higher end of that 1.5 grams. But that is basically the requirements of what it takes to build muscle. Now, in terms of building muscle, we already stated that you need some type of external stimulus. With regard to an external stimulus, it's not good enough just to have an external stimulus. You need to do progressive overload if you want to build muscle. Remember the said principle, specific adaptation to impose demand. So if you are constantly doing an exercise and you're doing the same number of sets, same number of reps, the same weight, your body is not going to be able to grow and get bigger, because your body has no reason to get bigger and stronger, because it is already capable of doing the activity that you are asking it to do for you. So if you want to build muscle, you need to somehow find a way to progress that exercise. And in terms of how you can do that, I am going to list off 5 factors of progression that you can incorporate into your programming to help you build muscle. When it comes to these 5 factors of progression, one factor factor of progression is going to be the actual movement and the complexity of the movement. If you are finding that an exercise is no longer challenging for you, what you can do is a more complex version of that exercise. Let's give an example. Let's say you are doing a kneeling squat, and a kneeling squat just becomes really easy for you. Well, the next step that would be a little bit more difficult and a little bit more complex would be a split squat. After a split squat, the next thing would be a standing squat, just your typical squat. And that is a way that you could progress the squat pattern to make it a little bit more difficult. The second factor of progression when trying to build muscle is going to be the frequency of your workouts. If you are only training 1 day a week, there's only so much muscle you can build on that type of training program. So if you are training for 1 day a week and you notice that all of a sudden your results just completely stop, try 2 days a week. And then if you do that for a while, you notice your progress starts to stop, try 3 days a week. Eventually, you are going to have to increase more days if you are only doing 1 or 2 days of training per week if you would like to continue to see muscle growth. The third factor of progression you can incorporate to help you build more muscle is going to be increasing the number of sets. When it comes to the sets, there's going to be an optimal range for building muscle. Generally, this range is going to be anywhere from 4 to 8 sets, depending on your activity level. If you are a beginner, it's going to be closer to that 4 range. If you are somebody who has been training for a longer period of time, then closer to the 8 set range per exercise is going to be ideal for muscle hypertrophy, which is building muscle. So let's say you are a beginner and you are doing sets of 4 for a particular exercise. Well, eventually you're going to have to increase the sets because more volume is going to equate to more muscle gain as long as you're also following these other factors of progression. But that is one way that you could progress your exercises without changing up the actual exercise itself. Let's say you're a beginner, you can do 4 sets your very first hypertrophy phase. Your second hypertrophy phase, you can go for 5 sets. Your third, go for 6, and keep doing that if you would like to continue seeing results and not stall on your progress. You don't have to do it every single phase. What you can do is do 4 sets for your hypertrophy phase, and every hypertrophy phase, keep doing 4 sets until you notice that 4 sets is no longer enough for you. Once you notice that you're not getting the benefit from 4 sets, then you could increase it to 5. There are many ways that you can play around with the sets. You don't have to do a specific number of sets every single phase and increasing it. You can do it the way that I just illustrated. So do 4 and keep doing that until it no longer works, and then increase the sets. The fourth factor of progression is going to be increasing the intensity and also the repetitions. When it comes to intensity and repetitions, the two are highly correlated because the intensity is the percentage of your 1 repetition maximum that you are lifting, and at any given intensity, you can only lift certain amount of repetitions. Let's say you are doing a barbell back squat and your 1 repetition max is 100 kilos. Well, if you were to do 60% of that, so 60 kilos, that would be referred to as 60% intensity. When we talk about intensity in weight training terms, we're not talking about perceived level of difficulty of an exercise. We are talking about percentage of your 1 repetition maximum. So when somebody says an exercise is really intense, do they mean that they are perceiving it to be very hard, or do they mean that they are doing a high intensity exercise, as in a high percentage of their 1 repetition maximum? As with all the other acute exercise variables, there is going to be a very specific range that is going to be optimal for muscle building. When it comes to intensity, if you are training at too high of an intensity, that is going to be better for relative strength. If you are training at too low of an intensity, that is going to be better for strength endurance. So if you want to build muscle, ideally anywhere from 70 to 76% intensity is where you should be training, especially if you're a beginner. That's not to say that you can't build muscle on higher intensity or lower intensity, but if you do go at a higher intensity or lower intensity, you will have to increase the training volume in order to see the same results. And in terms of the repetitions, when you are training from 70 to 76% intensity, for the average person, that's going to be anywhere from 9 to 12 repetitions. So if you are training in that range, that is going to be optimal for muscle building. Now, the fifth factor of progression when it comes to building muscle is going to be increasing your volume. Volume is essentially the number of sets that you've done times the number of repetitions that you've completed times the weight that you are lifting. Once you've added up all of that number, that is going to give you your volume load. And if you are noticing that you are not building any more muscle, then increasing your volume will help you to bust through that plateau. So if you've already increase the complexity of the movement, you're doing more sets, you're doing the proper intensity, then the next thing would be increasing the volume. And the way that you could increase the volume is by increasing your sets, reps, and the actual weight that you are lifting. If you do all of those things, then you should absolutely start seeing more results when it comes to muscle building. But at the end of the day, that is basically how you gain fat or lose fat and how you build muscle or lose muscle. Two completely different processes. When it comes down to gaining or losing fat, that's going to come down to calories in versus calories out. When it comes to building muscle, it's going to come down to your level of muscle protein synthesis versus your level of muscle protein breakdown. So you cannot turn your fat into muscle. If you are training right now and you stop training, you don't have to worry about it all turning to fat. You may lose some muscle when you stop training, but that muscle will not magically turn into fat. And people need to stop perpetuating this myth because it simply is not true. But that's basically it for today's video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to smash that like button so I know to make more of these types of videos in the future. And if you're either new to the channel or haven't subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, as I will be uploading new videos every single day. That's it for today's video. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again tomorrow.